I'm John Sipher.
And I'm Jerry O'Shea.
Between us, we have over 60 years of experience as clandestine officers in the CIA, serving in high-risk areas all around the world.
Part of our job was creating conspiracies, like being undercover, to deceive our adversaries.
Now, we're going to use that experience to investigate the conspiracy theories everyone's talking about, as well as some you may not have heard.
Could these be true, or are we being manipulated?
Find out now on Mission Implausible.
I had to do a little research for the introduction. It's like, holy shit, how do I introduce you? But let me try. So today we're really pleased and proud to introduce our agency colleague. We're all formers, and we'd like to welcome Valerie Plame to the show today. And I've got to get a piece of paper here to introduce you because there's so much. I wasn't sure what to leave in or leave out. So Valerie is a former CIA officer, as I said. Unlike John or I, who were under official cover as diplomats, Valerie was, and this is public knowledge, a non-official cover officer. So as a business person who doesn't get diplomatic immunity if she gets into trouble, unlike, John or I would. But there's so much more to Valerie, right? You're the author of 2 really fine spy novels. You've dabbled in politics. You've had a Hollywood movie, right? Fair Game with Sean Penn and Naomi Watts. You were the center of a huge political scandal and a victim of an actual conspiracy theory by the government, which is one of the fits with this show, why we want to talk to. You're also a mom and an activist for countering nuclear proliferation, which is really good. And maybe the most impressive thing is, like, I'm actually a fan of the music group the Decemberists, and they have a song, Valerie Plame, right? And now you're doing a spy cruise, and we want to hear more about that as well. But Valerie, welcome to the show. It's really good to have you. What a resume.
So much for
What a
having
life.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a journey, as they say.
You've lived in interesting times, whatever that means, right?
Well, the problem is you probably didn't intend to live in interesting times, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you normally would have worked at CIA, had a career, retired, and quietly.
I thought my career goal was to be chief of stations somewhere, which is like you run your own private fiefdom, and I thought that was the be all, the end all. And I miss my career. I love what I did. I was proud to serve my country, and it ended before I was ready.
So your goal was to have like a boring life like John and I did, but instead you went off and had these adventures. So let me throw the first question to, well, it's sort of maybe by way of explanation. So the political scandal that you were the victim of, let's be clear on that, collateral damage, was huge back 23 some odd years ago. It was headline stuff. I think newer viewers may not know it, and older viewers will struggle to recall it. And compared to the scandals we're having today, maybe it wasn't quite so big, but maybe, yeah, well, it was at the time. And it actually was. It was a government conspiracy theory, or not theory. It was a government conspiracy, and you got involved in it and were the victim of it. Could you take us through real quick sort of what happened, and then what it's like to be like a real victim of a conspiracy?
Sure. So I'll recap for your listeners to refresh their memory. It always shocks me when I meet young people that weren't alive on 9/11, but that's another story. So in July 2003, we had invaded Iraq, and we invaded in March. By July, no WMD had been found, even though the Bush administration had promised, and that was what they predicated the whole war on. We don't want to see the smoking gun in the shape of a mushroom cloud, if you recall, from then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. And my husband at the time, Ambassador Joe Wilson, wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times entitled "What I Did Not Find in Africa." And in it, he went after the central premise that the Bush administration had given the American public for launching a war of choice into Iraq, which was Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons. And he went right after the Bush administration, although in today's terms it was probably relatively mild. But he had said that the intelligence had been cherry picked, that the intelligence was fit around the policy, and so forth. And in retaliation, a week later, conservative columnist Robert Novak, who's now gone, wrote a column. And in it, he named me, Valerie Plame, talking about Joe Wilson and what he had said in his op-ed. And by the way, his wife, Valerie Plame, works at the CIA. So I knew immediately when Joe tossed the paper to me that morning at like 5:30 in the morning that, well, everything rushes through your head where your life is completely different than what it had been 5 seconds before. I knew the assets with whom I had worked were in jeopardy. People, even that I knew innocuously, in an innocuous fashion overseas, they too could come under suspicion. I knew that my covert career was finished because this column was syndicated, appeared everywhere. It was my true name. And of course, I was worried about my 3-year-old twins who were asleep in the room next door because not everyone thinks highly or kindly of the CIA. So that launched this huge political scandal that actually went on for years. What happened was the agency referred the leak of my name, to the Justice Department, and they started digging and digging. And ultimately, and it was just an ongoing media circus. I mean, I never wanted to be a public person. Obviously, I worked for the CIA. I was perfectly happy with my kudos coming from my covert colleagues. And our lives were turned upside down. It was really a dark time. I was called a glorified secretary because, I guess because I'm a girl, that was by a member of Congress. We were accused and called traitors and liars because this really went against what the Bush administration had laid out as the reasoning behind the invasion. It ended up, or at least that chapter of it ended in 2007 when the special prosecutor, special counsel Patrick Fitzgerald indicted and then convicted the Vice President Cheney's chief of staff, Scooter Libby, on lying and
Obstruction of justice, perjury. Yeah.
Obstruction of justice, exactly. Perjury. I like lying because it's just so much clearer what's happened. And I ultimately resigned from the agency because I felt I had the best job in operations. I didn't want to stay. Too much had happened. The agency did not treat me particularly well in the aftermath. I was totally radioactive. They didn't know what to do with me. So I found myself, we moved from Washington, D.C., where all this happened, to where we're in New Mexico now. Joe Wilson is gone, sadly. And then I just kind of began the next part and I, just had to figure it out. And I've done a lot of interesting things. You play the hand you're dealt. It's not what I wanted. I loved my career. I felt working on weapons of mass destruction, in particular, the nuclear threat, was meaningful and it was satisfying, but that's not what I got to do.
I recall those times really well. Now, I didn't work on Iraq or WMD. I was working on Russia things and stuff at the time. Mm-hmm. But, and I think probably people today have forgotten the intensity of it. So the administration, again, went to war for war of choice to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and it wasn't going well. And so I think they wanted to create a narrative of success. The president was going to run for presidency again. And so anybody who went against them to try to say that things weren't going well, like they do today, in politics can get quite ugly. And public servants usually stay out of the political limelight. Yes. And you got pulled into it. And my question really is, Scooter Libby was eventually convicted. It was part of this. Bush commuted his sentence. Trump eventually pardoned him. But there's a lot of people here: Novak, Karl Rove, Scooter Libby, Richard Armitage, Dick
Yeah,
Cheney, who were involved in
the
going
list
after
is
you.
long. It was a
Did
conspiracy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
did
they're
any of
scary.
them ever apologize? That's my question. Did anyone ever apologize to you?
No, with the exception of Dick Armitage, who, did not call me up personally, but I saw in some interview he sort of hemmed and hawed and acknowledged that probably he shouldn't have done that, which of course not. He'd been around Washington more than a minute and knew, I mean, he was just, all of them were banding about my name. And whether you know a person to be in covert or overt status with the CIA, you don't share that like candy with journalists, which Dick Armitage did. Um, and I typically am not a conspiracy minded person, but it really does apply in this case. The special prosecutor Fitzgerald really wanted to go after, and he tried to get convictions on Karl Rove and many others. There were many in the White House that were determined to make Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame look like, oh, they're just ridiculous. The shiny object. Look over here. Anything to distract from the real disaster of what was going on in Iraq. And so there was a conspiracy, and I can only imagine that Fitzgerald wanted, I don't know, 90% uh, probability that he would be able to convict. And because Scooter Libby took the fall for all of them, he couldn't quite gather what he needed to make that happen.
Yeah, I have to say, it's a long story, but I actually know Pat Fitzgerald, one of the most guys with the highest integrity and a really good guy.
I
And
agree.
and it was shocking that when he was voted one of the most eligible bachelors in the US when I knew he wasn't married yet, and he applied to get a rescue kitten and they turned him down because he was honest. And he said, well, I work 15 hours a day and I sleep 3 times a week in my office. And they said, yeah, you can't have a cat.
You
So it
can't
was
have a cat. I think he's
hopefully,
married now and has small children, so his
yeah,
work.
hopefully Pat finally got his cat, right?
Now,
Uh, but my so on this show, we talk a lot about deconstructing and debunking conspiracy theories, most of which are not true or only have a germ of truth. But this is really different. This isn't just a conspiracy that I'd like to drill down with more against you, or it wasn't so much against you, it was against your husband, and you were collateral damage. Um, but there was other conspiracies involved in this. And I just like to make a couple of statements and have you maybe run with it. The first is that right after 9/11, within weeks, that Vice President Cheney was talking about going after Iraq. And they had several different narratives. One of the narratives was that Iraq and Al Qaeda were, technical term, in cahoots with each other, right? And of course, there was the CIA and the intelligence community basically said there is no evidence for this at all, right? But then they had the fallback was, well, he's getting weapons of mass destruction, and that's a more
Nuanced.
set of things. But Cheney was saying they have weapons before we'd even tried to investigate it, really, right? And so one of the ways that he claimed that they did was that they were getting uranium yellow cake out of, I think it was Niger, and that's where your husband basically threw the bullshit flag and said, I went and I investigated, they're not getting it. And so he basically said, you're wrong. And then I want to throw in sort of one more thing, maybe one and a half more things, that the Pentagon wanted to go to war, right? They had with the White House, and they came up with this the Office of Special Plans under Doug Feith. There was all these neocons, Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, and then this guy Ahmed Chalabi, who was an Iraqi, and basically they created a it was a conspiracy. They created their own intelligence unit, not to find out what happened. They already knew what they wanted to say. They were just looking for any evidence they could cherry pick to find it. And eventually, I think they got the agency to take the fall, and they browbeat Tenet into. Well, we could talk about that, but the very fact that we went to war was based on a conspiracy with these people who went after you, and you were just sort of a conspiracy within that conspiracy theory, right? So I was wondering if you could just talk about how you view the conspiracies that brought us into this horrific war that cost thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives and cost me several years of my life in Iraq later.
Sure.
And I want to follow with one last thing because it's way too long.
His questions go on for a while.
I'm sorry.
Go get a drink.
I actually, when we went to war, I was in the agency. I actually believed they had it, and I thought we had the evidence, right? I realized later I was lied to. So I'm sorry, Billy. So over to you.
There's
If you could
a
take
lot there.
dog's breakfast of a question.
Let's start at the beginning. 9/11 happens, and we know within a matter of a week, 10 days, Cheney is at Camp David, and he's unfolding a map of Iraq, saying, there's not that many targets in Afghanistan, but in Iraq, now, there's something there. And we know that the neocons, which had been in the wilderness for some years, had prepared what is it called? Blueprint for American Century, Proposal for American Century. They had put this together, this manifesto in 1998, and it called for a horrific sort of attack or some sort of precipitating event to thereby launch American might and military power in ways to remake the world in the ways they thought it should be. And lo and behold, 9/11 happens. So now the neocons are in power, and they only have to take that proposal off the shelf, blow off the dust, and get to work. So, I think when I get asked a lot, why do we go to war with Iraq? I think it is best explained as a waterfall of events, cascading events. You have neocons in power. You have a president who's not terribly comfortable in the whole foreign realm of his presidency, having just been to China when his dad was ambassador there. He's relying very heavily upon a vice president who really wanted to see the executive, the so-called unitary executive theory, that it bolstering the executive power. And of course, he came up with this 1% doctrine. If there's even a 1% chance that there's, some sort of harm to come to the United States, we're going to. So all these things come together. We pivot from Afghanistan. We could have a whole show on what that caused, but we don't have time. So we quickly begin beating the war drums for Iraq. And why? They wanted to remake the Middle East in a much more pliable way for American and Israeli ambitions. And you spoke about Cheney. So talk about a conspiracy. Another word for it is circular reporting. He would leak something to, whether it's Judith
Miller.
Who had great real estate on the front of the New York Times, or any of these others. Chalabi was part of this. They had printed in the paper, Cheney, they say the front page of the New York Times. Cheney would then go on Meet the Press and go, just in Sunday's paper, they talk about whatever. A lot of it was these so-called aluminum tubes, which he claimed were being used as centrifuges to build up Iraq's presumed nuclear program. So there was a lot of that going on. And the agency did get sucked in. As you know, it was highly, highly unusual for anyone from any administration to cross the Potomac River and come to CIA headquarters. And all of a sudden, except to cut a ribbon or something, all of a sudden you've got Scooter Libby and his little minions showing up a lot more, talking to analysts. Now, I do understand their heightened concern. Of course, we all were. After 9/11, the world had changed drastically, and we didn't know what the hell was going on, frankly. But they also were looking back to the early 90s. If you recall, Saddam Hussein's son-in-law had defected went to Jordan, we debriefed him, and we're like, oh my God, we had no idea Iraq had been so far advanced in their nuclear programs. Stupidly, the son-in-law redefects, goes back, and he's shot by Saddam Hussein. But that's an aside. So there was a heightened sense of, we really don't know what's going on. So when I show up on the Iraq WMD desk, and there's clearly the whole machinery of state is sort of moving to the side, looking to focus on Iraq, what we had was nothing, because we had kicked out, or not we did, Saddam Hussein had kicked out the UN weapons inspectors in 1998. We didn't have a station there. We didn't have an embassy. So we, little light on the ground. We didn't really have much. So we had to start at zero in building up, assets and starting combing the world to see what did we know about Saddam Hussein. Now, when Joe Wilson went to Niger to investigate these reports of 500 tons of yellow cake uranium that allegedly had been shipped from Niger to Iraq, if that had proven to be true, that would have been significant, because clearly Saddam Hussein was seeking to reconstitute his nuclear program. But Joe went to Niger, determined this was all totally bogus, and he wasn't the only one. There were a lot of the ambassador there, four-star general, all of this, like, this is totally bogus. This is not. But boy, the administration latched on to that. And in fact, the infamous now 16 words that appeared in George Bush's State of the Union address of January 2003, before we went to war, references significant quantities of uranium. So all this is, this pot is stirring, and we go to war. And by the time Joe Wilson writes his op-ed piece, we hadn't found any WMD. Nada, nothing. The only thing that was happening was the the Baghdad Museum, which held countless precious ancient artifacts, was being looted. And the insurgency was ramping up. And I think the reason it all kind of blew up then, I don't know, this is just my speculation, but at that particular moment in time, the Bush administration was feeling a little bit anxious about all their things that they had said we were going to find. We hadn't found anything. And here comes along this ambassador. He had been in Iraq during the first Gulf War, had dealt with Saddam Hussein, Tariq Aziz, and the rest of the gang. And he's like, no, this is, it's not the best idea we had. And furthermore, your intelligence is totally cooked. And it just hit at a moment in time that Rove, Cheney, the rest of them were feeling a little apprehensive. And so they went into overdrive. I don't think this was all planned out. It's not in advance. But they quickly had to turn it and make it seem that Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame were ridiculous. They were traitors. They were liars. She works for the CIA, so you can't trust her. All this, and it just kind of went off from there.
So what's interesting, when your husband puts the op-ed in the New York Times at a time where they are politically feeling vulnerable because their policy is not going so well, and there's concern that maybe there isn't weapons of mass destruction, which was the reason for going to war, your name is leaked. It becomes a big sort of issue. People are already saying, hey, that's wrong. But then what they did, I think, go back after you too, is to say that Valerie clearly sent her husband. She worked for the CIA, and so the CIA, through Valerie, sent her husband in Niger to embarrass the administration. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. My mother, who's gone now, but she was around then, and bless her heart, she's like, why would they say that? That's not true. I know, Mom. A year before Joe wrote his op-ed piece was when he had gone to Niger and investigated this. It's not as though we had some sort of crystal ball to understand that we were going to go to war for sure, and that how can we best discredit the Bush administration. Joe and I were both, although we were socially liberal, and it doesn't matter how we voted. The fact is, you serve as an American, as you well know. When you're overseas, you serve as an American. You don't serve as a Republican or a Democrat. Joe had served in senior positions under both, type of administrations, and it was clearly just such a smear job in their attempt to detract or redirect the attention of the media on the failure of the policy.
Yeah. So when they leaked this, it was a number of people were involved. So there was a conspiracy. They sat around and said, okay, we've got to make him look bad.
Yeah.
And then somehow your name come up as well, right? They smeared you both. So now you're the victim of a conspiracy. And sort of, maybe could you give us just a little bit about sort of like personally, were there death threats? What happened to your career? Just sort of briefly, because we talk a lot about conspiracies, but we don't often talk about people who are the victims of it, who suffer from it, sort of the human cost of this. And so you're a public servant or a member of the deep state, if you want to be a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah. I was
Sort of
an
what happened to
intelligence
you and your kids
professional.
and your career and right.
Yeah, I describe it best as saying like falling down Alice's rabbit hole, where white is black and black is white. The people that they're talking about, Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame, in the media, on the radio, TV, the newspapers, they have nothing to do with us and our character. It is so distorting and destabilizing, particularly given my career, which was covert until that moment, where being in the newspaper was just an anathema. Why the worst thing that could befall someone. And yeah, it was really, really dark. We had the entire machinery of the state, and which is significant, behind the notion that they needed to crush us, and make us seem irresponsible and crazy. I will share with you. So Joe, in his nature, he was not a typical diplomat, right? I mean, he was rather belligerent and a flamboyant character. And he went out and he was very, very public. And I was just cringy. I was really in shock. I didn't know quite what to do, and furthermore, I was still working for the agency. So I couldn't go on Meet the Press and talk about it. And the agency was not giving me any guidance. I literally have, in the entire time from 2007 until we stepped away in 2000, sorry, from 2003 until I stepped away in 2007, the total amount of time I had with any senior headquarters officer was 10 minutes with Jim Pavitt. And if you know Jim, he spoke 9 of those minutes. So he was, yes. And look, I'm a big girl. I don't need someone to hold my hand, but you would think that there were some equities that we needed to mutually protect. Yes, there were death threats. I will tell you, I want to say in 2004, as everything, the political environment's heating up along with the presidential election. And my address in Washington, D.C., they found targeting papers in someone, an American Al Qaeda person, right? Remember that was a thing for a while. And I went to CIA security and I said, look, my security is one thing, but I've got small children at home. And I requested just through that period to have some extra security. The other ones, by the way, other ones that were targeted in that particular batch of intelligence were George Tenet, John Ashcroft. I'm trying to think who the other one was. They all enjoy 24/7 security protection. Anyway, the security people thought about it and then said, no, we're not. No, we're not. We're not. So I felt, you know how the agency likes to say, oh, we're all a family. We're all in it together. And that was not my experience. I was very, very much alone.
At least they
And
didn't put
again,
you on a sitting chat. So
what? Oh, I know, right? Thank God this is
they didn't have
really
signal.
before
Yeah.
social
Right.
media got going, because it would have been worse than it was, and it was pretty bad. It was, and it was a thing that went on and on and on. Judith Miller, the New York Times reporter, she was tossed in jail for a couple months because she refused to give up her sources, as though she's, in some priestly class. They literally they write uh, whole courses are around that First Amendment question and so forth. So I have a certain bias for sure on that. Living through that changed us, and of course you become more cynical. You don't read the media as you did before, and the personal toll was profound. And I would say the most for me, but just on the personal side of things, and I know, of course, thousands of US servicemen and women lost their lives in Afghanistan and Iraq, so I'm not comparing it to that. But I had small children. I will never get back those years of dealing with the crazy shit when
Oh,
they were.
sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I think we want to explore more like how that changed your life. And I'm interested in, I'm really surprised at the fact that the agency, for their own purposes, wouldn't want to engage with you more to protect it. But can you give us a little bit more background about yourself, how you got to the CIA, and what you did in the CIA that you can talk about before your whole life changed and became public?
Sure. I was recruited very young. I can't say the agency has forbidden me to uh, give many details. But I grew up my dad was a career Air Force. He was a colonel, fought in World War II. My brother was a Marine in Vietnam. He was wounded there. So I was drawn to this idea of public service. And when I got in, it was very clear the Soviets were the bad guys, and the United States were the good guys. And I thought it was a lot more interesting than what most of my friends were doing, to be honest. And it, you go through the training, and turned out I was good at it, and I liked it, and I liked the people with whom I was working. And so I did my different tours abroad, primarily in Europe. And then I really began to focus on what had been stood up in the mid 90s, the counterproliferation division, which I thought it came along, frankly, just in the nick of time, because the agency had been really at loose ends. The budgets were going down. Remember, there was the peace dividend. We're like, oh, we won. Let's all just go home. The wall came down. But within a few years, it was clear that the intersection of terrorism and WMD was a real national security problem. And so I was delighted to be able to work on that as I could. And I worked for a time with, I think you've had Jim Lawler on, who chased down AQ Khan, who was a merchant of death, as Time magazine called him. And so I loved what I did, and that was, as my mother said, why are they not telling the truth? I was working on what the agency, or more importantly, what the administration said was their priority, what they cared about. And
So we live now in so you were pilloried, you and your then husband were pilloried for telling the truth, right? I mean, this is, and then there was a conspiracy to smear you because that truth was inconvenient, right? There was no WMD. Everybody knows that the yellow cake in Niger was never shipped to Iraq, even though they claimed it was, and then had to sort of go back on that. Valerie, what's your sense now, 25 years later, when you look at like conspiracy theories that are completely without merit, like the 2020 election was stolen, right? Or
it went on, yeah.
yeah. So how do you view, coming from where a victim of a conspiracy, listening to conspiracies to create conspiracy theories, right? I mean, how is it? How do you look at the U.S. culture right now, where we conspiracy theories are not only rife, but they're Laura Loomer goes in with a conspiracy theory, right, and gets the head of the NSA fired, right,
Some
and
crazy shit there.
crazy
Listen,
shit. Yes,
yeah, I think that's the technical term. I think that we are living in a time where critical thought is no longer understood or applied. Of course, we're deeply polarized as a nation. Everyone's in their own foxhole, and it's an echo chamber of what you want to hear because it's very satisfying to have your worldviews validated. And as we become increasingly in our silos, whether it's media, our friends, they say, even where we choose to live, um, it will only get worse because the ability to apply critical thinking. And I try to do that. I try even now with, the news, I try to approach it with a open mind and test, you have to constantly test it and read a lot of different sources. And sometimes I come up short, but I'm sure I'm doing a lot more than what most people do because it takes effort. It takes
let me
effort.
gently push back on that just a little bit, in that we're all in our own foxholes, right? We all watched what happened on January 6th. It was not a parade of love, right? I mean, it was a violent incident. People were not greeted. They
Did you not
fought.
listen to our podcast last week, Jerry? It was a big horse that led them.
No, it was a love.
Yeah.
It was a
Yeah.
Woodstock, right? So,
Yeah.
but one side more, I mean, is dealing with facts, right? There's no evidence the 2020 election was stolen, right? I mean, I'll believe it if you give me evidence. I watched, January 6th on television, right? So there's some of us, okay, are dealing with, I think, provable facts, but a huge amount of people are, and we're all susceptible to conspiracy theories that we favor, but there is a set of facts, and it's really one side more than the other now. I would.
And I agree with you. That said, here's what's happening. For instance, where we are right now, we're in the throes of the early days of the tariffs. We don't know where this is going to go. If you read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or other mainstream, lamestream media, you will see that the stock market is crashing. China has placed retaliatory tariffs on what the Trump administration has done, and the outlook is pretty gloomy. If you go on Fox News or Newsmax or any of the others on the right, the top story is some blonde girl got kidnapped. Right? It's they'll talk, or something that Hunter Biden has done. You have to scroll pretty far down to see. I mean, there's no real criticism, but you have to scroll. This is not their top story. And so we are inhabiting very different universes. Um, that's where we are.
I just
So,
looked. They're billing it as the U.S. just made $5 trillion, not that the stock bottom's falling out of the stock markets.
so you talked a little bit about what it was like right then, and threats and dealing with your kids. How did you process having to transition to another part of life? So you moved away from Washington D.C. Tell us a little bit about the rest of your life and how this impacted it, and how you've gotten past it, if you have.
Yeah. And is Hollywood more fucked up than the agency? That's what I want to
We already know the answer to that, but go ahead.
know. It's more mysterious.
Hollywood's like high school, except better looking people.
True. That's a good point.
Yeah, the truth is, I was in shock for a few years, and it took me a while to find my footing again. And it didn't really happen for me because I was like, well, what am I going to do? Send out a resume? What do I put? How do I find another job? At the time I was still really young. I'm not ready to golf. So what happened was in 2009, I was contacted by the producers who did An Inconvenient Truth, the Al Gore movie on climate change. And they wanted to do for the nuclear threat what they had done for climate change. And they made a documentary, Countdown to Zero. And I helped narrate it and was very much involved. And that was a light bulb moment for me. I thought, oh, I can actually still advocate for this that I used to do covertly in a way that, is more overt, and it's meaningful to me. So that started it. And then I wrote a couple spy thrillers. I did write my memoir, Fair Game, which was a horrible experience because I had to sue the agency. They blacked out, so like I didn't exist until 2003 when my husband's article came out. It was dealing with the people in the publication review board. Talk about, and it was so ad hoc. Of course, we all signed secrecy agreements. I would chew off my right arm before I would ever reveal classified information. But I wasn't. I was talking about my story, and it wasn't particularly flattering to the agency, but it was the truth. It was the truth.
And not classified, yeah.
Not classified, but they made it very, very difficult. So then I wrote these two spy thrillers, all fictional, which is, you can tell a lot more truth in fiction sometimes. So that was fun. And then in 2019, I ran for Congress in northern New Mexico, and I lost in the primary. And can I tell you how happy I am? I mean,
your ad was good though.
Yeah, it was a great ad.
It was a good ad with the car and stuff. Yeah.
And which, of course, I learned at the farm, right? Who didn't learn that? They did about 40 takes before they got one that was, so I spent one whole day doing J-turns down this.
If you haven't seen it, I would encourage everybody. There's probably a YouTube of it.
I'm sure that it's on YouTube.
Yeah, it's a great ad.
But no, I ran for Congress with an open heart, right? I wanted to serve my country again. And I thought, I can do this job. I can do this and do this well. But I am so happy now not to be in Congress because it is utterly dysfunctional. It's always been bad, but it's just gotten worse. And so now I still do a lot of speaking. I do a lot of writing. I've got some Hollywood stuff that I'm, always got something percolating. You never know. And I do mentor a lot of young people. You can imagine, probably like yourselves, get a lot of people. Oh, my nephew is thinking about joining the CIA. Can you talk to him? And I'm sorry to say that the last one I spoke to, a really bright, wonderful young man who just would have been amazing. For the first time, I had to say, don't do it. Not now. And he agreed with me, and he's going to go off and get his doctorate at Oxford. He speaks several hard languages. It kills me because we need that fresh blood, smart. And why, given what has just happened through Doge and how humiliating the whole experience is, who wants to join?
Well, and they're firing young people that you go through the training, you go through all of that polygraphs, background check, security, you go through all the training, you move to Washington, you're spending money, and then they fire you like two years in. Like, it's insane.
Then not only fire you, but they send your name with your last initial in open channels from the agency to the White House.
PM, yeah.
OPM, whatever.
You're also involved with nuclear proliferation stuff, right? Counter proliferation stuff. And I just wanted your sense on, John and I have been talking to a lot of formers and a lot of senior folks, former senior folks. One of the concerns is with this administration, I think based off of a huge conspiracy or conspiracy theories certainly behind this, with NATO falling apart and our alliances falling apart. What is to keep some of our allies from saying, well, if we don't have the nuclear umbrella, Poland or Ukraine, which gave up its nuclear weapons, right? Because it got a guarantee from us and the Russians that they would have their territorial integrity, or Saudi Arabia. What would keep the world from why would you not want nuclear weapons, right? If there's
Yeah.
not the U.S.
No arms race, not to mention all the guardrails have been taken off. The
Right,
entire
right, right. And if you could
deal.
just sort of talk on that and
That's it,
why
'cause
we're,
it's
yeah,
crazy making. Yeah, all the guardrails are gone. The New START treaty is set to expire next year, which will not be reinvalidated. Yeah, we are entering a new arms race. I was on the board and continue to support the Plowshares Fund. They do great work in that space, but there's not a lot of the money has just drained out of the whole arms control field. Very
right.
little money. Um, I don't.
You've mentioned sole authority, and
Yeah,
with Trump having it, if you could just like 2 or 3 words on that, right? Like
I'll say more than
how
that.
fucking
So
scary that is.
sole authority for your listeners is the protocol whereby only one human being, the President of the United States, has the authority to launch offensive nuclear weapons or defensive. Sorry, both. And this comes out of the Cold War when we were afraid of a so-called bolt out of the blue from the Soviet Union. You don't want to convene a committee as missiles are incoming. I get that. But that was really, in fact, overplayed anyway. So right now we have whether Biden, who no doubt was compromised by his age, or our current president, who no doubt is compromised by his volatility. I don't like, and it's so antithetical to democracy to have just one person make this absolute horrific decision of whether to launch a nuclear weapon potentially to kill millions. So I was working quite a bit on that. Some legislation has been put forward, but right now things are in such chaos. I mean, it's just poo flinging chaos monkeys everywhere that you can't have you cannot really have sober, reasonable debate on this. And I don't think there should be much of a debate because it's just madness.
I listen to Laura Loomer has his finger on the button. People need to think about that.
So maybe if she suggests that he should shoot nuclear.
I want to scream. Yeah. Mike Walls was sitting in that meeting and apparently he didn't have much to say. Of course, he's already in the doghouse because of Signalgate. But imagine this young woman who's an influencer comes in and starts saying who the president needs to fire. This
31-year-old conspiracy theory woman who said that 9/11 was an inside job. She comes into the White House and says, fire these people, to include the head of the National Security Agency and people like Ratcliffe, who runs the CIA, and Gabbard, who runs the DNI, and Walsh, who runs the National Security Agency. Just take it and allow their own people to be fired. They're totally neutered. They have no authority over their own organizations. How can they lead their people when these crazies can come in and there's nothing they can do? They can't protect their own people.
I know. I think where it leaves us, it's obvious we are extremely vulnerable. We have pissed off pretty much everyone other than Putin, and he'll just take advantage of us. I'm kidding aside. I believe we are extremely vulnerable right now.
It's conspiracy theorists are in charge, right? The asylum has been taken over by the inmates.
Well, listen, we don't want to take up too much of your time, Valerie. I mean, we, as former professionals who worked in the same place as you, feel terrible that you got dragged into this public mosh pit. Politics can be ugly. We're all learning that now, but it's often been that way. And we're also very pleased that you've been able to come out of it and have such a successful professional career afterwards. And so we'd encourage people to follow Valerie, read her books, read her articles, and maybe if you can, get on this spy cruise.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that comes right from the heart. 'Cause John and I, as you know, we got dragged into the Hunter Biden laptop schlemazel, right? So we too have had our share of death threats. Ours are a little fresher than yours, but yeah, what you went through, we get it, and
I appreciate it.
yeah.
Well, such a pleasure. You guys run a great podcast, and I'm delighted to be one of your guests today.
Thank you.